Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. And before we get into the playoff preview of the wild card round, we've got to talk about all the coaching moves that are happening right now. Aaron, what are you seeing? We see 8 moves going around the league. What's interesting to you?
Well, I understand why a lot of these teams got rid of their head coaches this year. But for me, first of all, the most interesting thing for me is this idea of Baltimore getting rid of John Harbaugh, which just sounds insane. And it partly sounds insane because of the other thing I'm going to say about this year's coaching carousel, which is it doesn't feel like there's 8 qualified candidates out there to replace the 8 head coaches who got fired. So why on earth would you want to make it 9 when you have a head coach as successful as John Harbaugh? I don't understand the idea that they might, I guess, not let go of him, but trade his rights to another team. But that being said, the fact is Mike McCarthy is going to get recycled into one of these jobs. Adam Gase is going to get recycled into one of these jobs. It's now seeming very likely that Hugh Jackson is going to get recycled into one of these jobs.
Would you be excited if any of those guys were taking over a team that you were rooting for?
Well, I think that McCarthy certainly had success in the early days in Green Bay.
You got to give him some credit for the development of Rodgers.
You have to give him some credit, but his offense had really become stale in the last couple of years. I think that Adam Gase still qualifies as a good young offensive mind, although it's been pointed out the quarterbacks that he managed to really improve were Peyton Manning, who sort of was already, one of the greatest of all time.
Yeah, who was coaching who there?
Tim Tebow. And then I guess Jay Cutler had a pretty good year under him in Chicago. But it's not like Ryan Tannehill really developed in Miami, although obviously injuries really played a role there. And it sounds like Gase just turned off the players. Like he might be one of the guys who's a better offensive coordinator than he is a head coach.
It's really funny you mention that because one thing that I was just reading was that in Miami, they're really excited about the interview of their special teams coach, Darren Rizzi, who is a kind of a player's favorite, the opposite of Adam Gase. Here we're talking about John Harbaugh, the special teams coach in Baltimore, and we both think that he's, one of the better coaches in the NFL, not somebody that should be on the hot seat. And then last year around this time, we were talking about Dave Toub, the Chiefs special teams coach, who was getting all kinds of looks last year, and I haven't heard his name at all this year, which is frankly
I still think surprising. He would be an excellent candidate. I think it sort of depends what you want. If you want a fresh young offensive mind, then you want a fresh young offensive mind. If you want a good general manager type, not a GM like a team GM, but a CEO type who's going to manage the whole team and manage the locker room, I don't think you can do better than a special teams coordinator. They're already experienced at dealing with both offensive and defensive players. There's good management skills there. Belichick spent time as a special teams coordinator. Like you said, John Harbaugh did special teams for Philadelphia. I think that's a really good way to go.
You speak to the whole team every day. You've got to understand all the different aspects of the team. I do understand, you want the offensive play call. You want the Zach Taylor, the young offensive mind. For me, if I'm in that situation, though, I might prefer having the Dave Toub with the Zach Taylor as my offensive coordinator, where him going from a quarterback coach, it might be a big leap to say he's just going to take over the team. And now it's happened before. So I don't know Zach Taylor personally or too much about him, honestly, but setting up that sort of a situation seems to me like it would make more sense on the surface. So it's kind of interesting the way, especially like you said before, it doesn't seem like there are 8 really great candidates out there based on the way everybody's talking.
Zach Taylor, again, I don't know him at all, but just because Zach Taylor works for Sean McVay, we don't know that Zach Taylor can be Sean McVay, right? It seems like people have sort of decided that there's a couple of offensive coaching trees that they want people from, and they're just going to, everybody off that tree is going, right? So like Eric Bieniemy is getting interviews now because he's going to be the latest off the Andy Reid offensive coaching tree. But he's a running backs guy, right? He's not a passing expert. And Zach Taylor is the Rams QB coach, so he's going to get interviews. But, how much is he really inputting to what's going on with the Rams? I honestly have no idea. So, it just doesn't feel like – it feels like the only way to get 8 really interesting candidates is to go into the college ranks. And I'm a big fan of trying to steal someone from the college ranks. Although, I guess, which team is it that's now looking – the Bucs are looking at Brian Kelly from Notre Dame? That's not the, savvy young mind college regs grab.
Right. That's a little bit of a different, obviously over in Oklahoma, they gobbled up their guy real quickly to keep him off the market. I really have to talk to you, though. I want to talk about by far the most attractive job, obviously the Cleveland Browns job, and kind of handicapping that a little bit because I think it's really interesting what's going on there. You've got the internal guys, Greg Williams and Freddie Kitchens, and then you've heard lots of different things. Adam Gase was a name that was mentioned in relative to that position. Where do you see that one going, and what do you think John Dorsey's going to do filling in that gap?
It's tough because I think you want to keep Kitchens. You want to do everything in your power to keep Kitchens. But I don't know if Greg Williams is the guy I really want as my head coach, given his mercurial personality. I could see him really turning off the players pretty quickly within a year or two. So does that mean you have to make Kitchens your head coach in order to keep him? Or can you find a head coach hire who Kitchens has worked with? Maybe somebody from a defensive side of the ball where Kitchens stays your offensive coordinator and still runs the offense. Could you, I don't know, hire someone like Eberflus as the head coach and have Kitchens be the offensive coordinator?
So here's my issue with that. If you really want to find a way to keep Kitchens in the building, I think you've got to make him the head coach. And here's why.
Yeah, I think you do.
You have a good season next year, and then he's a head coach of somebody else's team in 2020. So it becomes a really hard game to play where, okay, play it out. We keep him as the offensive coordinator. We either have a good offensive season and he's gobbled up as somebody else's head coach, or we have a bad offensive season, and what do we go out of our way to keep this guy around for?
Yep, I think you're right. And that means you got to make the jump and do it now. In some ways, it's like what Tampa Bay did when they let Lovie Smith go and hired Dirk Koetter, which is that they knew that Koetter was going to get taken by some other team within a year as a head coach, so they just made the jump to make him their head coach right away.
Or at least they convinced themselves that was going to happen.
Well, I think a lot of people at the time were talking about the idea that was going to happen. I mean, they weren't the only people who thought that was going to happen. In retrospect, it may not have been the best hire, but it's certainly something that people were talking about.
So I think you're right. I think people, for all the good job that the Browns have done and the way that they finished the season under Greg Williams, we need to remember a little bit about Greg Williams. This is the Bounty Gate guy. And I think as John Dorsey considers guys like Greg Williams and like Adam Gase, there's some interesting past that I just want to bring the listeners into a little bit here, because I think it's a fascinating kind of underrated aspect of this. And that is that if you go back to the 2009 through 2012 Saints, where Greg Williams was around there, at the time, Joe Vitt was the assistant head coach, and he was doing the linebackers. But Joe Vitt was a Sean Payton guy, and Greg Williams was decidedly not. He was kind of doing his own thing with the defense. They did a good job, no doubt about it. But obviously, there was the whole Bounty Gate whatever that came up at the end of that one. Now, when all the punishments came down, Greg Williams and Sean Payton and Joe Vitt, there was a real split there. I think everybody remembers pretty well that it wasn't a happy ending between Sean Payton and Greg Williams. And what you may not realize that ties into Adam Gase there is that Adam Gase is Joe Vitt's son-in-law, right? Joe Vitt his daughter is married to Adam Gase. So this all comes back around in a really interesting way with Greg Williams becoming that defensive coordinator, the head coach now in Cleveland, and doing a good job there. And then people mentioning, oh, this makes so much sense. John Dorsey's going to hire Adam Gase. Not so fast. There's kind of a butting of heads that's inevitable as soon as you bring those two guys into the same conversation that people might not realize on the surface. So it's just kind of fascinating how the NFL goes round and round. And
I also think Gase is going to get a head job somewhere, so he doesn't need to take an offensive coordinator job.
Right. I believe that John Dorsey already came out and said that he wasn't interested. I think a lot of people were trying to connect those dots, and John Dorsey wasn't interested in interviewing Gase, or maybe it was vice versa. So that could be a reason why that's not going to be a dot that connects.
When Greg Williams was the head coach in Buffalo, they went 3-13, 8-8, 6-10. So he didn't, his one time we've seen him be a head coach. Look, obviously, right? Someone said, how do you find the next Bill Belichick? Well, you actually don't find a hot young mind. The next Bill Belichick is actually a guy who's coached before and is getting his second chance and has learned from his first experience. problem is, does Greg Williams seem like a guy who's learned from his first experience? It doesn't really seem like that's not a descriptive phrase that I would use with Greg Williams. So,
all right, we'll be fascinated to see how those coaching vacancies shake out. Let's move forward and let's talk about the big games going on this playoff weekend, though. We have an exciting wild card round, and it gets kicked off on Saturday at 4:35 p.m. It'll be the ESPN game, the 10-6 Colts at the 11-5 Texans, the battle of the two AFC South teams. This is a big matchup that I'm really looking forward to. And I think that the road team has got a decent chance in this one. What do you think?
Colts, Texans, 3. DVOA would agree with you because the Colts are higher. In regular full season DVOA, the Colts are 8th and Houston 11th. And in weighted DVOA, the Colts are 4th, I believe, and Houston is 13th. Although I will point out Houston is higher in weighted than they are in regular. It's just other teams are even higher. It's not like Houston has not gotten worse as the season has gone along. In fact, Houston's best single game by DVOA was week 17. But there's no question that if you look at the play-by-play breakdown, Indy is better, and their 1 fourth down decision in overtime, again, in the first game between these teams, away from basically having the same record. If these teams had tied in their first game, they would both be 10-5-1.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating game. Two really good teams, very good quarterbacks, very good defenses, and they've been super close each of the times they played earlier this year. One thing that I'm looking at breaking down the stats here is the amount of too high that both of these teams play. Both Indianapolis and Houston play more cover 2 than any other teams in the league. Colts are first in cover 2 usage at 28%, and Houston is second. That 28% mark for the Colts cover 2 is 9 percentage points higher than the Texans. Texans are just at 19%. It's more than double the rate of the fifth place Browns, who are at 14%. And it's nearly triple the NFL average of 10.5%. Indianapolis loves to play that 2 deep much more than any of the other teams in the league, mixing in the Tampa 2 and the regular cover 2. I think it'll be really interesting to see how that matchup plays out, especially as you flip it on its other head. Both those teams are pretty good at playing in terms of EPA per snap on cover 2 on defense. We look at the quarterbacks, though. Andrew Luck is 3rd out of 32 quarterbacks in EPA per attempt against cover 2, while Deshaun Watson is down at 17th. The other aspect that I think is interesting, Watson has scrambled against non-cover 2 coverages 55 times this season and averaged 0.45 EPA per attempt when doing so. Against cover 2, however, he scrambled just 4 times, and he's got negative EPA per attempt on those 4 scrambles. So a little bit of a tougher look to run against potentially for Watson, and Luck has fared better against this coverage that we can expect to see a lot of throughout the day.
I'll note that Deshaun Watson averages more yards per pass against zone coverages than he does against man coverages, but most of his touchdowns this year have come against man. He has 18 touchdowns against man and only 6 touchdowns against zones. So yardage-wise, he's actually better against zones. But when it comes to the high EPA throws, he's got more picks and fewer touchdowns on those zone plays. It's also interesting that the way the zones work for each team creates a really different weakness. For Houston, the weakness seems to be against number 1 wide receivers. They're 31st in DVOA against number 1 wide receivers. And in the last game between these teams, T.Y. Hilton had 199 yards. For Indy, the weakness is against tight ends. They've allowed the most yards per game to tight ends, 76 yards per game. And in the last game between these teams, the Houston tight ends, most of whom you've never heard of, Jordan Akins, Jordan Thomas, and Ryan Griffin, combined to catch 11 out of 11 targets for 151 yards, which is pretty good for 3 guys that nobody knows.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about before how as T.Y. Hilton tends to go, the Colts tend to go. So that's a good matchup for the Colts in this game as we're looking at it. And I'll be fascinated to see how that one turns out. One other note just on the cover 2 stuff. This year, one thing that we're going to start making available here at Sports Info Solutions is not just the type of coverage that you're in, but also the pre-snap look. So we're recording, are you showing single high pre-snap, 2 high, and then do you rotate into a middle of field open coverage, middle of field closed coverage? And just as we said before, the Colts and Texans run a lot of cover 2. Unsurprisingly, when they show too high, which they do at the Colts at a league high rate of 78%, 70% of all plays, including runs, they show that too high look. They spin to single high just 37% of the time. The Texans spin to single high just 35% of the time. So when you see too high on your TV screen, that's a pretty good indicator that you are going to end up seeing that cover two look on the back end.
One thing I'll note is the cornerback coverage stats, which obviously get a little bit of an asterisk when you play so much zone because, we're only looking at when the cornerback is actually in coverage, not when there's a hole in zone. But for Indianapolis, Kenny Moore is 13th in yards per play and 22nd in success rate. Pierre Desir on the other side of the field is 63rd in yards per play and 50th in success rate. So definitely a difference between the two cornerbacks, although Moore tends to play shorter passes and Desir plays longer passes.
So Desir's getting more of the targets downfield and he's giving up more of the yardage.
But also a lower success rate. So that the success rate controls a little bit for the down and distance and how far the passes come.
Right. Very interesting there. Very interesting. All right. We can move ahead to the second game of the weekend, that Saturday night game. It's going to be on Fox. The Seahawks at 10-6 at the Cowboys at 10-6 should be our nice Saturday night defensive battle in this one. What are you looking forward to?
Well, Seattle, of course, has the highest run-pass ratio in the league, and Dallas was 5th in DVOA against the run. So their strength runs right into what Seattle wants to do on offense.
Yep, strength on strength for sure. To put a number to it, the Seahawks offense calls a run play 49.9% of the times. So that's any run plays or passes, or non-quarterback runs. So usually you'll see that scrambles will get included in your run pass splits. We're taking scrambles and we're including them as pass plays. They've actually called runs on just about 50% of the time, easily first in the league, and they're 5th in yards per carry. Defense is 5th in yards per carry around. And when you break it down in terms of inside, outside, wherever you want, the Seahawks excel at outside runs. They excel at inside runs. And the Cowboys, just like you're saying, they excel at stopping outside runs, inside runs, you name it.
Right. The one worry for the Cowboys here is going to be the broken tackles because the Dallas is 27th in broken tackle rate on defense, and Seattle is 6th in broken tackle rate on offense. And when I say Dallas is 27th, I mean the highest, right? That they have a lot of broken tackles. And even though Leighton Vander Esch has been spectacular this year, Jeff Heath with 21 and Jalen Smith with 18 are both in the top 10 of defenders for broken tackles. And
it doesn't surprise me. You look at Jalen Smith play, and my God, he's just a fantastic athlete. He runs around all over the field, but he drops his head when he tackles. I hate to keep harping on this because I forget who I was watching last week that Tre'Davious Smith knocked himself out dropping his head on a tackle last week. And you're endangering the person that you're tackling. You're endangering yourself. And on top of that, you're going to end up missing tackles. So please see what you hit, Jalen Smith, and you could be one of the best linebackers in the league.
It's sort of the Ryan Shazier issue where Ryan Shazier was always high in broken tackles because if you're everywhere on the field, you're going to also miss more tackles because you're going to get to a place but not really be looking where you're going, and then you'll miss the tackle.
One matchup that we talked about in this game, the Seahawks defense, they play the 4th most zone coverage in the league at 53%, and their favorite coverage is cover 3. No surprise there. They're the Pete Carroll system. They play cover 3 36% of the time. Now, Dak Prescott completes 72% of his passes versus zone and only 57% versus man. Now, the yards per attempt is very close there, and part of that is just really a reflection on the type of passes that he's throwing against zone to running backs and short passes like that. But that could be a tough matchup there when you look at how the success that he has had keeping the offense alive against the zone and the Seahawks and what they like to do back there on the back end.
Right. Most of his touchdowns are versus man coverage, even though he's got the similar yards per pass against man and zone.
Right. And we see part of that because as you get closer to the goal line, you'll see teams play a little bit more man. So sometimes you get more of those touchdowns against the man zone splits get a little bit wonky in that regard when you get into the red zone. But certainly, like you're saying, that's where the big plays have come. And those big plays have come to Amari Cooper against man coverage. He's been the real catalyst there for when Dak hasn't struggled against man. It's been because Amari Cooper's been there saving his day. Looking at the other side of the ball, On passes 20 or more yards downfield, Russell Wilson ranks third in the NFL with a 48% completion percentage, and he's tied for fourth with a 60% on-target percentage. The Cowboys defense ranks 26th on deserved catch rate allowed on deep passes. So that's basically controlling for the accuracy of the pass by the quarterback and drops by the receivers. How often do you deserve to have a pass completed on you? So could be something there where Russell Wilson is looking down the field. Tyler Lockett could be in store for another big game. So look out for that when the Seahawks have the ball.
Yeah, well, get ready for a lot of them to be broken scramble plays because Dallas is 6th in defensive pressure rate. Seattle is 30th in offensive pressure rate. So I bet you're going to see a lot of that. Broken plays, scrambles, Wilson going downfield.
Right. We said they'll call 49% of their plays as runs, and then we'll see how many more Russell Wilson adds to it because
right, but also a lot of them where he's running around back there because he's under pressure and then he finds Lockett open downfield.
Yep, they do that scramble drill. Anything else that you wanted to touch on in that game?
I think the other thing I would say, just pointing out Dallas's defense is very strong against starting wide receivers. Obviously, Byron Jones has had an excellent season. They're weaker against the slot receivers, the tight ends, and the running backs. So that's an interesting, to see Lockett and Doug Baldwin and expect them to have a big game. That would go counter to what the strength of the Dallas defense is. The strength of the Dallas defense would more suggest that you're going to see big games from the lesser-known Seattle offensive weapons.
Well, 17 weeks ago, I would have told you it would have been a big Rashad Penny game. Not so sure anymore.
Is he alive, technically? No.
All right, let's go ahead to Sunday, and let's talk about the CBS game. Yes, that's right. That means we get Tony Romo time. The Chargers at the Ravens, maybe the most interesting game of the weekend, if you ask me, a rematch of what we saw a few weeks ago. The Chargers 12-4, but going on the road to the 10-6 Ravens. What are you looking for in this one?
Okay, so the Ravens, I have so much to say. This team is really misunderstood. What has been driving them since Lamar Jackson became the quarterback is defense and special teams, not the offense. The running game has not been spectacular, but it's looked spectacular because they've played a schedule of really easy run defenses. In fact, the only team they played that didn't have a poor run defense was the Chargers. So if you look at Baltimore since week 11, they're 11th in run DVOA, but 3rd in VOA. So 3rd without opponent adjustments drops to 11th with opponent adjustments. Then you look at their ratings by week for the Lamar Jackson period, and you get to this crazy thing where the Ravens' best game passing and worst game running was week 16 against the Chargers. The Ravens' success rate on runs against the Chargers was 33%. In the other 6 Lamar Jackson games, their success rate on runs was 54%. Okay? And the other thing is remarkable is Lamar Jackson, right, limited sample size. But Lamar Jackson is much better in limited sample size against zone, 8.6 yards per attempt, than against man, 4.8 yards per attempt. His best passing game by far was against the Chargers with 8.1 yards per pass. And only the Colts play more zone than the Chargers. And there's no team that blitzes less than the Chargers. And Lamar Jackson, in a small sample size, had only 4.8 yards per pass against the blitz. So it's kind of remarkable that we're going to go into this game, and they're going to be talking about the Ravens running game, the Ravens running game, the Ravens running game, and everything in the stats and everything in the first game between these teams suggests that if Baltimore wants to win this game, they need to pass the ball, that this is going to be the passing game.
Right. So a couple of really interesting things just to build on all the points that you're making, because I'm also fascinated about when the Ravens have the ball in this game, because you're right. They have been really inefficient on offense since Lamar Jackson has been there. However, they've eaten up the clock and they've enabled their team to stay in these games with a lot of lesser teams like you're talking about. And then they played great against the Chargers. So I want to look back, though, against, into some of these macro things and then also back into that game. So like you said, Jackson's been much better versus zone than he's been against man this year. When facing man coverage, his completion percentage drops 20 points, his on-target percentage by 18 points, and his IQR drops from 98 to 53. The Chargers, as you mentioned, they play the second most zone coverage in the league, 58%, right behind the Colts, and they failed to adjust their defense when facing the Ravens in Week 15. They played zone 54% of the time in that game, which is just below their average, but it's still much too much of the time. Another thing to go along with what you're saying, the Ravens rank third in called run percentage, run plays excluding scrambles with 45%. The run-heavy offense could be a problem for the Chargers because the Chargers' defense is very much designed to stop the pass. They love to play with 6 or more defensive backs on the field. They do that 63% of the time. That's by far the highest amount in the league. The Packers are second, 23% of their snaps behind them. And the Chargers, for some reason, didn't get out of that when facing the Ravens in Week 15. They played 80% of their plays against the Ravens offense with 6 or more defensive backs on the field. That resulted in Lamar Jackson throwing for a career high in passing yards. The Ravens ran for 5.2 yards per carry against the Chargers' dime defense. They only ran for 3.3 yards per carry against all the other Charger defensive packages. So at some point, I think the Chargers got to do something to say, hey, we're playing the Ravens. We're not playing against the St. Louis Rams, greatest show on turf here. We've got to put some more big bodies on the field to stop this running game. And then the fascinating thing will be, can they do it in man? Or do they have to sit in this dime-heavy zone that's really not conducive to playing against the Ravens?
Yeah, I mean, I will say they had success against the run in that first game, but a lot of it may have been when they weren't playing the 6 dime. I mean, look, they've been good against the run this year, even playing the dime all the time, right? They're 10th in run defense DVOA this year. And the Baltimore's run offense DVOA in that first game was minus 40%, which is their worst running game of the 7 Lamar Jackson. So the dime, they allowed a little more yards per carry, but based on the situation, it actually wasn't that bad in the first game, I would argue. But, yeah, it still seems like not quite the best defense to play against the Ravens. The thing is that the Ravens they don't come out there and, tighten up and let you get a lot of guys in the box against them. Even when they have 2 tight ends, which is most of the time, they'll spread it out and they'll be in shotgun. So you'll think that they'll be in a passing type formation. So you may be thinking, all right, we'll just put our dime package against that, and then they'll run from that.
Right. It'll be an interesting matchup to see how that shakes out. One other thing that I know we were both looking at earlier in the week was the play action versus non-play action, Joe Flacco versus Lamar Jackson splits. It's really amazing. If you look at the numbers, they've run play action much, much more frequently with Lamar Jackson, just jumping the percentage of time that they use it from under 20% to over 30%. And on top of that, the success rate has just been ridiculous. So with play action, Lamar Jackson's IQR is up at 109. Without play action, it's down at 76. Joe Flacco, meanwhile, with play action was just at 76, and without play action went all the way up to 97. So this was an offense that was not predicated on the play action, that didn't use it very often, didn't need to use it very often. Joe Flacco didn't really like it. And now you're seeing a ton of play action, 60 play action attempts to just 110 non-play action attempts since Lamar Jackson became the starter, and a lot more success for Lamar Jackson when he uses it.
Right, and I will point out that the Chargers, the difference between on defense, play action and non-play action is roughly league average.
What about on the other side of the ball, looking at the Ravens defense against the Chargers offense? Did you have anything that you wanted to point out there?
Well, this was interesting because a lot of the tendencies for the Ravens in coverage were outweighed by Chargers tendencies in the first game. Ravens are number 1 against running backs in the passing game in DVOA, but 22nd against tight ends. But Antonio Gates was just 3 for 5 for 21 yards in the first game, while Justin Jackson, the running back, was 7 for 10 for 47 yards, which is kind of an okay game. 19 of those yards came on 2 third and forever plays that didn't really matter. So it'll be interesting to see whether the tight ends can have a better game in this game than they did in the first one, given the Ravens' weakness against tight ends, especially if we actually see Hunter Henry on the field, which is definitely possible. Probably not in every snap, but maybe in the red zone.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see there with those guys in the game how it goes. One thing, John Shirley was pulling some notes. He did some really outstanding research on the Ravens defense because he was looking into some things that they've been doing different over the course of the entire year that's made them really such a standout defense this year. So here are some of the things that he pulled. They've cut their use of base defense almost in half this year. They used it 31% of plays in 2016 and 2017, dropped it to 17% in 2018, which is 28th in the NFL. At the same time, they've increased their use of nickel. It's increased by 18% since 2017, and they've changed how they play nickel. In 2018, they've played 18% of their overall snaps in 3-3-5. That's a big difference from 9% in 2016, 6% in 2017, up to 18% in 2018, the amount of playing 3 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. Meanwhile, they've drastically changed how many players they keep in the box, which has coincided with that completely. They line up with a light box, which we define as 6 or fewer players in the box on 70% of the snaps, which ranks 5th highest in the league. So less base, more nickel, more light boxes. And one of the big reasons for that change has been how they're using Eric Weddle. Weddle specifically, the percent of plays he's lined up in the box has gone down the last 2 years. He was only in the box on 8% of his snaps in 2018. It was at 20% in 2016 and 13% in 2017. So that change in Eric Weddle has coincided with this change in what they've been doing in terms of lightening up the box. Now, with this light box, what have they been doing? What have they been running after the snap of the ball? They're number 1 in blitz percentage this year at 24%. If you've been watching them on TV, you've noticed it. They're up 8% and 13 spots in the rankings from where they were last year. They are lightening the box, and they are coming at you all the time. And we're seeing a ton of cover 3 on the back end. A 10% increase in cover 3 on the back end, that's telling you that we're seeing a lot of zone blitzing out of the Ravens this year, out of these light box nickel looks that they've been specializing in. It's been a fascinating change to a defense that hasn't changed much in years, but we really see the numbers and how they bared out. Looking into this matchup, not a whole lot of great news for the Ravens. Phillip Rivers has been very good against both nickel and cover 3. IQR over 100 in both situations. His IQR is usually over 100 in all situations. He's had a very good season. But it'll be really interesting. You know, it's fine. It's great at the end of the year to get to put some numbers to what we've been seeing all year. And the Ravens really cutting what they've been doing in terms of base and doing different things and blitzing out of it a lot on the back end to counteract a lot of these very aggressive offenses has been really effective.
Yeah, I will say Rivers 9.55 yards per attempt against zone, only 8.0 yards per attempt against man only. That's still pretty good. And against blitzes, Rivers 8.1 yards per pass. Again, less than he gets against 4 pass rushers, but still pretty darn good. Rivers just had a really excellent season in pretty much every way. So, yeah, this is a strong matchup. This is a really good game, the Ravens and Chargers. I'll also point out that despite those light boxes, the Ravens ranked 6th in run defense DVOA, and that their defense is better than it looks by conventional stats because they played the 5th hardest schedule of opposing offenses this year. So whatever conventional stats you see, the Ravens defense is actually better than those conventional stats will make them look.
Moving on, there's one more game before we sign out. The 4:40 game on NBC on Sunday, your modified Sunday night football, will be the Eagles sneaking into the playoffs, traveling to Chicago and the Bears. Are we giving Nick Foles any chance in this one going to a tough-looking Chicago team?
There's always a chance, my friend.
That's why
there's always a chance. That's why we play the games. But people need to, as excited as Philly is about getting into the playoffs, the fans are very excited. There's a big difference between Nick Foles leading you to 2 wins at home and Nick Foles leading you to 3 wins on the road.
Right. And let's look a little bit deeper into the matchup. What has Nick Foles done this year? Nick Foles has been first in the league in both completion percentage and on-target percentage when pressured. That's quarterbacks with a minimum of 50 attempts because he had to qualify. He's completing 65% of his passes when pressured, on-target percentage up at 83%, which is 10% higher than second-place Kirk Cousins. Can he keep that going against this Bears pass rush? We'll tell a big story in this game, and that's going to come down to, honestly, a lot of how the Eagles game plan around not allowing him to get into a lot of 5-step, 7-step drop situations.
One thing is that the Eagles are not going to be able to run very much. Chicago is 2nd in run defense. The Eagles are 27th in run offense. So it really does depend on Foles to win this game for them on offense. There's not going to be a lot of running.
To support what you said, they've called 39% of run plays when Foles starts versus just 35% when Wentz starts. So there's been a difference in how much they've relied on that running game, and it's going to be tough against that Bears defense.
Yes, although I will say there is a strength against strength battle here. The Bears are third in defensive pressure rate, but the Eagles are seventh in offensive pressure rate. And I remember we talked, I don't have the splits for this year, but last year, the Eagles had a much lower pressure rate allowed when Foles was quarterback than when Wentz was quarterback. And I'm going to guess that the same is true this year because they call the offense differently for Foles than they call it for Wentz.
Yes, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's definitely true. He's sacked much less, he's pressured much less, and the ball's out of his hands much more quickly. So definitely something true there. I'll tell you, it'd be really fascinating. One thing that I think does play into the Eagles' hands is we don't know what Mitch Trubisky is going to look like in the playoffs. Sure, he's been better over the course of the season, but we don't really know what we're getting here. It'll help him out that he's playing at home. But if we get the good Nick Foles, it could be a troublesome situation if Trubisky, shows some chinks in the armor.
One of the things I'm interested in looking at here for the Philly defense is to blitz or not to blitz. We know that Jim Schwartz does not like to blitz very much. The Eagles rank 30th in the league in frequency of the blitz. But Trubisky has really struggled this year passing against blitzes. He has 8.3 yards per pass against a four-man rush, but only 5.6 against 5, and only 4.5 against 6. But here's the problem with that. The problem with that is that doesn't include scrambles. And we know that Trubisky can scramble against your man blitzes and get a ton of yardage. So if you're going to blitz him, you want to do some sort of a zone blitz, and that's not really something Philly does a lot. So it's sort of an interesting, do they switch up their strategy or do they just play the defense that they're used to?
Right. It'll be fascinating to see. I would definitely be much more concerned about what Trubisky can do with his legs rather than him really beating you with the arm. Definitely an interesting game there. Kind of an upset watch to keep an eye on, but it's not looking as likely as I think either the Chargers or the Colts, who I think have better chances of the road teams this weekend.
No, the projected lines from our projections for the premium picks, this is the largest projected line of the 4 games. This is the least likely upset of the 4 games.
Right, and with the Seahawks Cowboys being the other one, I'm not even sure who the favored team is in that game.
Right. The Cowboys are favored at home, but by less than 3, indicating that Vegas suggests that Seattle is the better team.
It'll be an awesome weekend. I'm very excited. It's been a great buildup throughout the 2017 season where we saw ratings go up and the league is healthier, including with this keeping your head up while you tackle rule that seems to be helping things a little bit in some ways and more to come.
You know that's just going to show up in a playoff game, though, when you don't expect it, and one team is going to feel like they're completely screwed over.
Right. It always does. And I guess that's also why they play the game, I guess.
It's coming.
Okay, let's sign off. One thing I want to mention, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Justin Stein, our producer the whole year, doing a fantastic job. Thank you, Justin. And also, we had great research this week put together by John Shirley. And I want to point everybody to the Sports Info Solutions blog at sportsinfosolutionsblog.com, where you can check out an awesome article by one of our other researchers, Bryce Rossler, on 2nd and 10 decision-making. Everybody loves to talk about 2nd and 10. If you throw on first down, do you have to run on 2nd down? How does that work? Bryce looked into it, and he's got a really interesting column there for you, so check that one out. Anything you wanted to point the people to, Aaron?
Oh, just all the end of the season stuff on Football Outsiders, final DVOA ratings, clutch and counter season in review, quick reads season in review. All the stuff is there and ready to be read, going through the whole 2018 season and getting you ready for the playoffs.
Ton of fantastic content there. Don't miss it, and we will talk to you next week.